Let me ask you one question before we begin. Right now, in this very moment, is your mind quiet? For most of you, the answer is probably no. Things you need to do today, worries you haven't resolved yet, unpleasant memories from the past, anxiety about a future that hasn't even arrived yet. Your brain is generating something, constantly, even right now. But here's a fascinating question. Is your dog worried about paying tomorrow's bills? Is your cat lying awake at night, replaying a memory of being hurt? No. Animals don't carry those kinds of worries. Not because they're wiser or stronger than us, but because their brains are built differently. The moment you understand this difference, everything becomes clear. Why meditation isn't just a relaxation technique, but a scientifically grounded form of neural training that physically rewires the brain's hardware. Over the next 18 chapters, I'll walk you through exactly what meditation does to the human brain, in the language of modern neuroscience. Chapter 1. The Brain's Commander, the Role of the Prefrontal Cortex. Inside your brain, there is a headquarters that oversees everything. It's called the prefrontal cortex, PFC for short. Located at the front of the frontal lobe, this region governs all of your highest-order mental functions. What does the prefrontal cortex actually do? It regulates emotions. It suppresses impulses. It makes plans. It makes decisions. It focuses attention. It makes moral judgments. And it perceives the reality of your current situation. All of this happens in the prefrontal cortex. In short, every function that makes you act like a human being originates here. So what happens when the prefrontal cortex stops working properly? Emotions explode. Impulsive decisions follow. Planning and attention fall apart. Social norms get ignored. Judgment becomes cold and harsh. We call it losing your reason, and that's exactly what it is. Now here's something interesting. The prefrontal cortex isn't unique to humans. Animals have one too. The difference is in its size, and it's an enormous difference. These numbers may surprise you. In the human brain, the prefrontal cortex occupies approximately 29 to 30% of the total cerebral cortex. Nearly a third of your entire brain is dedicated to this one command center. Chimpanzees and gorillas? Around 15 to 17%, roughly half of ours. Dogs come in at about 7%, cats at about 3.5%. Rats have barely 1 to 2%, essentially a trace. Everything we've come to dread, worrying about our children, financial anxiety, dread about the future, and everything we aspire to, like the philosophical realization that we are one with the universe, these are experiences available only to a creature that has devoted 30% of its brain to this single command center. This is the scientific reason why dogs don't lose sleep worrying about tomorrow. And paradoxically, because animals have such small prefrontal cortices, they live in the present naturally, without any practice. They never suffer what Buddhism calls the second arrow, the suffering created not by events themselves, but by the stories we tell about them. So, what do animals use their prefrontal cortices for? Chimpanzees and orangutans make tools, calculate social hierarchies, and even engage in deception. Dolphins and elephants recognize themselves in mirrors and mourn their dead. Dogs suppress the impulse to pounce and wait for exactly the right moment to act. They read their owner's emotions with remarkable precision. But the difference isn't just size. The human prefrontal cortex contains critical subregions that simply don't exist in animals. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for suppressing emotion, performing complex calculation, and building long-range plans, is highly developed in humans and barely present in other species. Animals use their brains for immediate survival and reward. Humans use theirs for futures that haven't arrived yet and values that can't be touched. The conclusion writes itself. Humans gained a massive prefrontal cortex through evolution and built civilization with it. But we also received a sentence: endless anxiety. That is precisely why, for human beings, meditation, the practice of governing this overgrown command center, is not optional. It is essential. Chapter 2. 4 neurobiological changes meditation makes to the prefrontal cortex. Meditation is not simple psychological relaxation. It is neural training, what scientists call rewiring, and it is among the most effective forms that exist. What does meditation actually do to the prefrontal cortex? Let's go through 4 core changes. The first is physical change, an increase in gray matter thickness. 8 weeks of mindfulness meditation produces a measurable increase in the density and thickness of gray matter in the prefrontal cortex. This physically resists the brain atrophy that normally comes with aging. Consider age-related forgetfulness. What was I just about to do? Or where did I put my keys? These lapses are usually not failures of memory itself. The real problem is a decline in attention and working memory. Working memory is a kind of metacognitive whiteboard, a temporary workspace where the brain holds and processes information. The prefrontal cortex runs this whiteboard. Meditation strengthens it. When information enters the brain with more complete attention, it gets encoded more fully, and later there's much less to forget. The second change is the suppression of mental noise, control over the default mode network. The brain has a neural circuit that turns on automatically whenever you're not doing anything in particular. Scientists call it the default mode network, or DMN. In the untrained brain, the DMN runs unchecked, generating an endless stream of mental noise. Regrets about the past, anxieties about the future. This is why your mind feels exhausted even when you haven't done anything. The meditator's brain is different. A prefrontal cortex trained through meditation effectively suppresses the DMN. The runaway chain of pointless worry can be broken by an act of will. Staying fully present, here, now, becomes possible. The third change is amygdala reduction and top-down inhibition. When a threatening stimulus arrives, a worry, a conflict, a fear, the brain's alarm sensor, the amygdala, fires like a siren and floods the body with emergency signals. This is why your chest tightens and you can't sleep. Meditation physically shrinks the amygdala. Simultaneously, it strengthens the neural pathways through which the prefrontal cortex exercises what scientists call top-down control, suppressing the amygdala from above. Think of it as keeping a fire extinguisher permanently on standby inside your brain. The fourth change is the acceleration of the anxiety resolution circuit. Even the most balanced person encounters anxiety. Money problems, family stress, unexpected crises. These arrive regardless of how well you've practiced. The difference is how long you stay trapped inside them. In the untrained brain, an anxiety-triggering stimulus can generate a loop that persists for days, even weeks. In the meditatively trained brain, the moment a threat arrives, the prefrontal cortex sends an inhibitory signal to the amygdala at something close to the speed of light. The situation is objectified in a single second, and the loop is severed. One-sentence summary. Meditation is weight training for the brain's muscles. Just as strong leg muscles in old age prevent falls, a brain that has been strengthened through meditation is dramatically less likely to suffer the cognitive decline that leads to forgetfulness or dementia. Chapter 3. Types of meditation and their neurological differences. How to choose. Like gym training, the optimal meditation depends on which brain muscle you want to build. Chest day, back day, legs, each has its purpose. Meditation works the same way. Let me walk through the 3 main types. The first is focused attention meditation, mindfulness and breath meditation. This is the foundation. It means placing your complete attention on the sensation of breath entering and leaving the body. In the brain, this develops the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the rational brake pedal, the CEO's command center. It's most effective when your mind is flooded with anxious, repetitive thoughts that chase each other in circles, when you startle easily at small sounds, and when you want to build the concentration and mental clarity that leads to success and wisdom. The second is loving-kindness meditation, also called metta. You close your eyes and visualize yourself, your family, even people who have hurt you or the universe itself, and you genuinely, sincerely wish them peace and happiness. This develops the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and the mirror neuron system, and it produces the strongest oxytocin release of any meditation practice. It's most effective when you want to rapidly establish the "I'm okay, you're okay" state, when you want to dissolve the defensiveness and resentment that poisons relationships, and when you want to directly experience the deep sense of unity with all things. The third is open monitoring meditation. Rather than suppressing thoughts or holding attention in one place, you watch whatever arises, worries, anxieties, emotions, from the perspective of a neutral witness. There goes a worried thought. There's that anxious feeling. You observe without engaging. This maximizes the metacognitive circuit, the brain's capacity to see itself thinking. It's most effective when you want to rapidly escape a particular anxiety state, and when you want to identify and gradually correct your own emotional patterns. Here's a practical starting sequence. For the first 1 to 2 weeks, begin with breath meditation. Drop everything else and for 3 minutes, place your attention entirely on the sensation of air passing your nostrils and your belly rising and falling. This reactivates the neural memory of your prefrontal cortex and immediately shuts down the worry engine, the DMN. Once that feels comfortable, add loving kindness. After your breath settles, bring to mind yourself and the people you love and offer the silent wish. May we be safe. May we be at peace. This releases oxytocin and serotonin, raising your happiness baseline and completing the self and other affirmation. Now let me introduce 2 particularly powerful practices from the Buddhist tradition. The first is Gwanam Juryak, the continuous recitation of a sacred name or mantra. From a neuroscience perspective, this practice represents the most advanced and complete expression of focused attention meditation. 3 reasons explain its power. First, it forcibly shuts down the worry engine. In regular breath meditation, intrusive thoughts can easily wedge themselves in. Mantra recitation closes that gap. You're speaking aloud, hearing your own voice, and attending to the sound itself simultaneously. The brain's language center, auditory center, and attentional center are all occupied by a single stream of data. There is simply no bandwidth left for the mind to run its usual narrative of anxiety. Second, it calms the amygdala through sound frequency. Repeating a phrase at consistent rhythm and pitch stabilizes the heart rate and breath, shifting the brain from beta waves, the aroused, anxious state, to alpha and theta waves, deep calm. The amygdala is quieted with striking speed. Third, it delivers both focused attention and loving kindness simultaneously. Gwansam Bosal, the figure whose name is recited, is the embodiment of universal compassion. During the practice, a psychological sense of refuge forms in the mind, a vast, warm presence watching over me, and anxiety dissolves as happiness hormones are released. Think of it this way. Mantra recitation places a single, powerful, clean program, the Bodhisattva's name, in full-screen mode on the brain's display so that the malware of worry simply cannot run. The second practice is 108 Bows of Repentance. This is a complete brain treatment program, neuroscience, psychiatry, and exercise physiology in one. 3 effects. First, immediate DMN shutdown. Standing and prostrating your full body while reciting repentance texts and counting repetitions forces your brain to simultaneously process sensory data from the body, verbal output, and numerical sequencing. There is no bandwidth remaining for the usual fears and anxieties. Second, a serotonin flood through genuine repentance and the dissolution of guilt. True repentance is not self-punishment. Neurologically, it is a high-level act of metacognition. When you acknowledge, "I acted from greed and made a foolish decision," the brain views your own shadow from the perspective of a calm, external witness. The moment it accepts the mistake without resistance, the amygdala, which had been braced for defense, stands down. Serotonin surges. The weight of guilt lifts. The door opens to what might be called genuine self-affirmation in spite of everything. Third, the body achieves balance, what Korean medicine calls water rising, fire descending. The 108 bows engage more than 70% of the body's major muscle groups in sustained aerobic movement. The rhythmic breathing activates the parasympathetic nervous system, inducing deep physical relaxation. The brain reads this as safety, lowers its defenses, and enters the alpha wave state of warmth and openness. To put it plainly, 108 bows of repentance use the body's movement to subdue the rampaging amygdala, the language of repentance to empty the mind's residue, and the whole integrated act to reset the prefrontal cortex, the command center, to its cleanest possible state. Chapter 4. Meditation and the Prevention of Dementia, the Scientific Evidence. Dementia happens when brain cells degenerate and the brain's volume begins to shrink. Meditation is the most powerful available shield against this degenerative process. Harvard neuroscientist Dr. Sara Lazar found that the prefrontal cortex thickness of long-term meditators in their 50s matched that of non-meditating people in their 20s. In a separate study, ordinary people who practiced mindfulness meditation for just 30 minutes a day over 8 weeks showed a statistically significant increase, around 3 to 5%, in the density and thickness of gray matter in the prefrontal cortex. The changes are not uniform. The volume of the left prefrontal cortex, the seat of positive emotion and contentment, increases most intensively. Meanwhile, the physical size of the amygdala noticeably shrinks. The brain's rational braking system grows stronger. The alarm system grows quieter. Why does size increase at all? Not because new neurons suddenly appear in large numbers. The growth comes from the connective tissue between neurons. The synaptic branches between brain cells thicken and densify, like muscle fibers after consistent training. At the same time, increased blood flow to the prefrontal cortex stimulates the growth of fine capillaries, adding physical volume and density. One-sentence summary. The prefrontal cortex of a long-term meditator is like the powerful thigh muscle of an elite athlete. While the untrained brain grows thin and contracted with age, the meditator's prefrontal cortex, fortified daily by breath and focused attention, is physically thick, dense, and resistant to aging. The optimal hardware. Now I want to address something critically important. Personality changes that come with aging are also a direct result of brain aging. It's common to see someone who was once gentle and patient become irritable, full of petty anxieties, or rigidly set in their ways as they age. People around them say, getting older made them mean. But from a neuroscience perspective, this isn't moral deterioration. It's a warning signal. The brain's hardware, the prefrontal cortex braking system, is wearing out. When the brake thins, the amygdala, the primitive alarm organ deep in the back of the brain, runs without restraint, like a horse broken free from its harness. Small provocations produce immediate, explosive irritation. Distant, unformed futures generate overwhelming dread. At the same time, the production of serotonin and oxytocin, the calming, bonding hormones, drops sharply with age, compounding the problem. When you observe this pattern in someone around you, the scientifically accurate response isn't, "they got mean." It's, "their prefrontal cortex brake pads are worn down." This brings us to an important comparison. People invest heavily in preventing muscle loss as they age. They go to the gym, eat protein, and worry out loud about thinning thighs. Yet the very brain that governs all of that manages the body, holds wisdom, regulates character, the prefrontal cortex that is slowly shrinking year by year, receives almost no attention at all. Here's the distinction that matters. When the thighs weaken, the body stumbles. When the prefrontal cortex shrinks, the person collapses. The personality, the reason, the dignity, all at once. A lifetime of accumulated wisdom vanishes. Irritability pours onto children. The mind tortures itself with anxieties about futures that will never arrive. The road leads toward geriatric depression and dementia. There's an even more remarkable fact. Building the brain's muscle protects the thigh muscle too. Why do people give up on exercise halfway through? Because it's uncomfortable? Because they don't feel like it? In other words, because the impulse control and executive capacity of the prefrontal cortex has weakened. The meditator who has trained the prefrontal cortex has also built something Buddhism calls the paramita of diligence, a powerful self-governance. The strong brain commander maintains the habit of physical care. True well-aging lives in the thickness of the prefrontal cortex. The elders whose eyes are calm and deep, who are genuinely kind, genuinely wise, even in old age, are the ones who have consistently fortified this region through meditation, reflection, repentance, and generosity. Squat for your thighs, meditate for your brain. And what you eat matters as much as how you practice. You are what you eat is 100% accurate from a neuroscience and molecular biology perspective. Food is not just fuel. It is the raw material from which brain cells are built and the source of the substrates that produce the brain's hormones. Here's something surprising. 90% of serotonin, the calming, happiness-producing neurotransmitter, is manufactured not in the brain but in the gut. Feed the gut a diet rich in dietary fiber and prebiotic foods, and the intestinal microbiome flourishes, producing a steady, abundant supply of serotonin. The most direct fuel for the self and other affirmation state flows from the gut. The antioxidants in vegetables and fruits, polyphenols and their kin, physically defend against the inflammatory processes that cause brain cells to shrink. High meat consumption and ultra-processed foods accumulate free radicals that attack the prefrontal cortex. The traditional monastic preference for plant-based eating wasn't only about nonviolence towards sentient life. It was, it turns out, a neurologically optimized dietary protocol. Neuroscientists also know this. If they were asked to name the single most powerful dietary intervention for brain youth, the answer, paradoxically, would be not eating. When the body enters a fasted state, the brain recognizes that resources are limited and activates the prefrontal cortex at full capacity. This triggers the release of a substance called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, sometimes called the brain's own growth hormone. BDNF repairs damaged and atrophied neurons and lays down new neural pathways. It physically makes the brain younger. 3 practical steps. Step 1. Stop eating after dinner and maintain a fasting window of 12 to 14 hours. This initiates the BDNF cycle and the brain's self-cleaning process. Step 2. Eliminate ultra-processed foods, high fructose corn syrup and refined flour, and fill half your plate with fresh vegetables and whole grains. This restores the gut microbiome and restarts the serotonin factory. Step 3. Practice mindful eating. Put the phone away and give your complete attention to the sensations of chewing and tasting. Mealtime itself becomes a meditation that quiets the DMN. Forcing protein supplements into your body for your thigh muscles is a lower-order health strategy than choosing clean, simple foods for your brain. Savoring vegetables, enjoying the calm of a fasted morning, and treating every meal as a practice. Chapter 5. 3 psychological mechanisms meditation activates. Now let's look at how meditation changes the way the mind relates to everyday anxiety and worry. The first change, the brain's worry brake is restored. The trained prefrontal cortex effectively suppresses the runaway DMN. The endless chain of anxious thought can be interrupted by will. The constant internal broadcast of worst-case scenarios, the fake news your mind produces about your own life, grows much quieter. The second change, rational control is restored. As the amygdala shrinks and the prefrontal cortex's inhibitory networks strengthen, the heavy burden of daily worry becomes lighter. You find yourself less consumed by it. And when worry does arise, it is far less painful. This is not the result of deciding to think positively. The brain's hardware has been physically restructured. The change is real. The third change, self-affirmation and other affirmation transform anxiety into trust. When the prefrontal cortex is stable, positive psychological changes follow automatically. Excessive worry about a child is usually rooted in anxiety. A stable prefrontal cortex generates a different response. This child has their own life, and they carry within them the strength to navigate it. Worry becomes trust. Financial stress and existential uncertainty shift as well. I'll find a way through this somehow, and this too shall pass. These aren't mantras you force yourself to repeat. They become the brain's default response as flexible coping capacity develops and the flood of cortisol is contained. Here is a striking psychological finding. Research suggests that 96% of what we worry about either never happens, 40%, is already in the past, 30%, or is a minor thing we cannot change, 26%. Awakening the prefrontal cortex through meditation is the equivalent of shutting down the broadcasting station inside your head, the one that has been running fake news about your life 24 hours a day. Chapter 6. Clinical Evidence of Personality Change. Those who transform versus those who stay the same. A person's fundamental personality and behavioral changes are the most reliable clinical evidence of whether they are genuinely rewiring their brain through meditation or simply sitting with their eyes closed, lost in thought. Some people sit on a meditation cushion for an hour every day and return to daily life just as reactive, just as anxious, just as quick to criticize others as they were before. Others meditate for 5 minutes and become measurably calmer, measurably wiser. What accounts for the difference? 3 hallmarks distinguish those who genuinely change. First, reactivity diminishes. In situations that would once have triggered immediate anger, the prefrontal cortex brake activates in a single second. Oh, I can feel anger rising in me right now. This metacognitive awareness, the capacity to observe one's own emotional state, interrupts the impulse before it becomes action. Second, a quality of steadiness becomes visible in the face and voice. Serotonin and oxytocin flow naturally. The expression softens. Interactions with others lose their edge. The "I'm okay, you're okay" state that we've discussed becomes embodied, visible in the quality of presence the person carries. Third, resilience increases dramatically. When something goes wrong, the person doesn't collapse into days of anguished rumination. Let me find a way through this. The response arises quickly, and equanimity returns with remarkable speed. Those who don't change are, in most cases, spending their meditation time with the default mode network fully active, lost in the same loop of regret and anticipation they entered with. They are sitting with their eyes closed, but what they're actually doing is running the anxiety script over and over. This doesn't rest the brain, it deepens the anxiety circuit. There is also a subtler danger, what some teachers call spiritual ego. The quiet conviction that I'm a person who meditates, I'm more aware than the people around me. This is the self-affirmation other negation pattern we've discussed, and it makes relationships worse, not better. The true test of meditation, according to neuroscientists, is how much of the cushion's peace you carry into the rest of your day. The fake version is calm only during the session, then immediately irritable the moment life resumes. The genuine version has encoded the felt sense of the calm alpha state so deeply that when stress arrives, when someone is rude, when something unexpected happens, the regulated state can be summoned instantly. Your speech is your data. Your behavior cannot lie. When someone's presence is genuinely kinder, genuinely more patient, genuinely more flexible, that is the signature of a brain that is actually growing stronger. There is also a fascinating physical phenomenon that tends to follow deep meditation practice, a spontaneous drive to clean and organize one's surroundings. This is not a personality quirk, it is a neurological event. When the mind is flooded with DMN noise, even a chaotic room doesn't register. The brain's energy is entirely consumed by its internal simulation of anxious futures. But as meditation clears that noise and the prefrontal cortex brightens, the present environment suddenly comes into focus. The external world becomes visible with a clarity that wasn't there before. And with that clarity, the discrepancy between inner order and outer chaos becomes uncomfortable. The natural response is to resolve it. Cleaning also becomes its own meditation. The sensation of a cloth against a surface. The visual satisfaction of things returning to their proper place. The complete, simple actuality of a floor becoming clean. Each of these is an object of focused attention. And while you're fully present with them, the DMN goes quiet. The body is working, but the mind is resting. This is why the great teachers, in every tradition, have always included physical labor in the practice. Sweeping the courtyard is not a chore, it is a form of attention training. The state of your room is a mirror of the state of your mind. Chapter 7. A case study, the neuroscience of people who startle easily. Many people are startled by small sounds or sudden movements far more intensely than others seem to be. Those around them sometimes joke, "You jump at your own shadow." But from a neuroscience perspective, this is evidence that the person's internal alarm system has become hypersensitized, that the brain's alert threshold has been calibrated to threat. 4 primary causes explain this. The first is an overheated amygdala. Someone who startles easily is likely carrying an amygdala that has become extremely sensitized or physically enlarged and overactive. Chronic stress, deep-seated anxiety, or unprocessed memories of sudden shock or trauma create and sustain this state. The brain has quietly begun treating the environment as unsafe, categorizing it as a place where danger could arrive at any moment. So even trivial stimuli, a door closing, a footstep, trigger the full emergency alarm, and the body contracts. When the amygdala is running this hot, cortisol flows continuously, and chronically elevated cortisol makes the amygdala even more reactive. It's a self-reinforcing cycle. The second is a weakened prefrontal cortex. In a healthy brain, even a genuinely startling stimulus is followed within a second by the prefrontal cortex saying, "That's not a threat, you're safe." This top-down regulation catches the amygdala's initial spike before it cascades. But in burnout, when mental energy is depleted, when the mind is already saturated with unprocessed worry, the prefrontal cortex doesn't have the resources to perform this regulatory function in time. The alarm fires and nothing dampens it. The startle response is full volume, unfiltered. The third cause is an unconscious defensive posture, the self-negation, other negation state. When someone carries an implicit sense that the world is unsafe, people can hurt me, I can be criticized or dismissed at any moment, the amygdala is chronically primed. Oxytocin, the bonding and trust hormone, drops. Cortisol stays elevated. The nervous system is like a bowstring held at full draw all the time. Small perturbations release enormous force. There is some good news here. When the brain is guided toward trust, toward the genuine sense that others are fundamentally safe, oxytocin increases, and this chronic tension begins to dissolve. Loving-kindness meditation is directly relevant to this cause. The fourth cause is a constitutional trait, the highly sensitive person, or HSP. This is where an important distinction must be made. The first 3 causes are acquired states. They can be improved through practice and healing. The fourth is a built-in neurological characteristic. Psychological research classifies approximately 15 to 20% of the population as HSPs. These individuals process sensory, emotional, and social information more deeply and intensely than others. Sound, light, others' emotional states, subtle environmental shifts. The neuroarchitecture is simply built with more input channels. The same stimulus that passes through a standard nervous system at ordinary volume arrives at the HSP's nervous system turned up significantly. This is not a pathology, it is not weakness. The label easily frightened or overly sensitive is neurologically inaccurate. HSPs are frequently gifted with extraordinary empathy, with depth in artistic and creative work, and with a natural attunement to the suffering of others. And these 4 causes can co-occur. A person can be constitutionally an HSP and simultaneously carrying an overheated amygdala and a depleted prefrontal cortex. Each cause requires its own approach, and meditation, which simultaneously calms the amygdala, strengthens the prefrontal cortex, and cultivates the self and other affirmation state, is relevant to most of them at once. Chapter 8. The permanent upward adjustment of the emotional baseline. Every person has a default happiness level, a psychological set point that functions like a thermostat. Win a lottery, experience great fortune, and after some time, the reading returns to its original setting. Suffer a significant loss or hardship, and over time, the reading climbs back as well. This is why studies find that lottery winners, measured a year later, report roughly the same life satisfaction they had before the win. But meditation can change the set point itself. The left prefrontal cortex, the seat of positive emotion, contentment, and engagement, is activated and kept active by consistent meditation practice. With repetition, the emotional baseline is permanently raised. You don't need something exceptional to happen. Walking down the street, eating a meal, Ordinary moments begin to carry a quiet signal. This is good. This is stable. The brain generates this automatically, not because circumstances have improved, but because its hardware has been recalibrated. The speed of recovery from anxiety also changes dramatically. In the untrained brain, an anxiety-generating event can echo for days, even weeks. In the trained brain, the moment a threat arrives, the prefrontal cortex engages in a fraction of a second, objectifying the situation, severing the loop. The feeling passes. Chapter 9. Deep Meditation, the Dissolution of Boundaries and Cosmic Connectedness. Beyond standard meditation practices, mindfulness, breath awareness, lies a deeper register of meditative experience that produces remarkable neurobiological changes. We ordinarily experience a boundary between self and other as obvious, fixed, beyond question. Neuroscience suggests this boundary is a construction, a product of one specific brain region and not an inherent feature of reality. The parietal lobe, located toward the back and top of the brain, contains an area whose function is to orient the body in space, to determine where you are, where your body ends, and where the world begins. It builds the sense of being a bounded, located self. When long-term meditators enter deep states of absorption, fMRI scans reveal something extraordinary. This parietal orientation system goes quiet. Its activity is fully suppressed. It falls silent. In that silence, meditators report a vivid, living experience. The wall of my physical self dissolves. I am connected to and merged with the entirety of what exists.
This has a psychological dimension as well. When the sense of separation between self and other is experientially suspended, compassion arises without effort. The neural logic becomes clear. To attack or resent another being is, through the mirror neuron system, to damage and attack one's own prefrontal cortex. The brain understands this, not as an idea, but as something directly felt. What Buddhism intuited through thousands of years of contemplative investigation, that we are not ultimately separate, modern neuroscience is now confirming through fMRI scanners and particle accelerators. The ancient and the scientific have arrived from different directions at the same place. Chapter 10. Neurotransmitters, the brain's self-made medicine. Meditation is the process by which the brain manufactures its own highest quality neurological nourishment without prescription. The first is dopamine. Most people associate dopamine with pleasure, gaming, eating something delicious, getting a reward. But the dopamine that flows during meditation has a different character. When you enter deep focus on a single object, the breath for example, the brain experiences a profound satisfaction that comes not from stimulation but from control. Research suggests dopamine release during meditation may increase by up to 65% above baseline. This dopamine strengthens working memory and sustains the brain in a state of clarity and motivation well after the session ends. The second is serotonin. Serotonin is the calming, stabilizing hormone, the one that gives you a sense that things are fundamentally okay. During meditation, serotonin surges. It quiets the overheated amygdala and dissolves the spiral of worry and anxiety that circles through an unguarded mind. Serotonin flows most abundantly when you hold yourself in genuine self-affirmation, when you treat your own existence as something valid and worth caring for. The third is oxytocin. Oxytocin is the bonding hormone, typically released through physical touch, through the experience of being trusted and held. What's remarkable is that it is also released powerfully during solitary meditation, specifically during practices that extend care and goodwill outward. When you hold in mind the wish that others be well, that all beings be at peace, the oxytocin flood begins. It amplifies the brain's social cognition, dissolves defensive barriers, and generates a deep, quiet sense of safety in the world. And alongside these three, one more substance is affected: cortisol. Meditation powerfully suppresses the release of cortisol, the stress hormone that, in chronic excess, acts as a neurotoxin. The total picture. Meditation simultaneously floods the brain with dopamine, deep engagement, serotonin, calm, and oxytocin, connection, while removing the cortisol that corrodes the neural architecture, all without a prescription.
Chapter 11. The Neuroscience of Self-Affirmation and Other Affirmation. I'm okay, you're okay. Transactional analysis, the psychological framework developed by Eric Berne, describes a psychological state it calls I'm okay, you're okay. From a neuroscience perspective, this state is among the most effective cognitive tools available for optimizing the prefrontal cortex, equal in power to meditation itself. In this state, the amygdala quiets. The environment is not perceived as threatening, so the alarm doesn't activate. The prefrontal cortex is free to make clear, objective, rational decisions. The hormonal pattern is equally beneficial. Affirming oneself releases serotonin and dopamine. Motivation and working memory improve. Affirming others releases oxytocin. Empathy and relational capacity expand. And throughout, cortisol is suppressed. The mirror neuron system activates. Defensiveness falls away. Real communication, rooted in genuine understanding of another person, becomes possible. The quality of all relationships shifts. Chapter 12. The Dual Nature of Neuroplasticity. Why Consistency Matters. Neuroplasticity is the brain science concept that the neural circuitry of the brain can physically change in response to experience and training. It means the brain is a living tissue, not a fixed organ. Earlier generations of neuroscientists believed the brain was essentially static after adolescence. Modern neuroscience, emerging in force from the 1990s onward, found something entirely different. The brain changes continuously across the entire lifespan. Even function lost to brain injury can, in some circumstances, be recovered through training. The changes meditation produces in you are direct evidence of neuroplasticity at work. But neuroplasticity has two faces, and this is critical to understand. The positive side. Consistent meditation gradually thickens and strengthens the neural pathways it activates. Each session of quiet breath awareness teaches the brain, this is my normal state. Gratitude cultivated repeatedly builds the circuit that generates gratitude spontaneously. Extended compassion practice deepens the oxytocin architecture. The negative side, neuroplasticity, is non-directional. It serves whatever pattern is rehearsed most. If you stop meditating entirely, the circuits that meditation strengthened gradually weaken. The gray matter density decreases. The amygdala may resensitize. The prefrontal cortex's inhibitory capacity softens. This is exactly like the muscle loss that follows weeks without exercise. Use it or lose it is not metaphor. It is neurobiology. And the darker implication, the anxiety-generating circuits are also neuroplastic. Chronic worry strengthens the DMN. Frequent anger makes the amygdala more reactive. Whatever you rehearse, the brain optimizes for. Medicine has a term for the physiological decline that follows cessation of training, detraining. Research suggests that measurable neural changes begin to diminish after about 2 weeks without practice, and that substantial structural reversal can occur within 1 to 2 months. After 6 or more months, the brain may largely return to its pre-training state. But there is hope in this, and it's important. The brain retains what might be called neural memory, the scaffolding of previously developed circuits. A concert pianist who hasn't played in a decade begins recovering their technique at a rate that strikingly outpaces any beginning student. The architecture hasn't been erased, it's been dormant. The same holds for meditation. A year of consistent practice leaves a structural residue in the brain. After 3 months of no practice, when you return, you will reach comfort, depth, and the felt sense of the meditative state far more quickly than any beginner. The brain remembers. Once learned, never forgotten. This is what that phrase means at the level of neural architecture. This leads to a critical truth about consistency. The most common misconception about meditation is, I need to do it perfectly, an hour a day, for it to matter. The truth? Imperfect consistency outperforms perfect intensity with intermittent gaps. Neuroplasticity responds more to frequency than to duration. 1 hour of meditation today plants a seed. 5 minutes of meditation every day for 3 months permanently rewires a circuit. The math is revealing. 5 minutes per day for 365 days is 1,825 minutes, roughly 30 hours. 1 hour per day for 50 days is also 50 hours. By clock time, the second approach contains more meditation. But for the purposes of neuroplasticity, the first approach, distributed across 365 consecutive days, is far more powerful. 3 practical strategies to build and protect the consistency. The first is the streak principle. The brain learns continuity quickly. Once consecutive practice is established, a single break sends a signal. This routine is interruptible. Protect the streak. If you absolutely can't do your usual practice, do 3 minutes. Do 1 conscious breath. Do not allow a 0. The second is the minimum viable unit principle. The question is never, did I do my full practice today? The question is, did I do something? Neuroplasticity's greatest gains come from avoiding 0. The third is trigger stacking. Attach meditation to an existing habit. Immediately after brushing your teeth in the morning, sit for 5 minutes. The brain reinforces the 2 circuits simultaneously. Over time, brushing your teeth begins to spontaneously activate the meditative circuit. On timing, neuroscientists identify a golden window of heightened neuroplasticity, roughly 4 to 8 a.m., when the brain's electrical activity is predominantly in the alpha wave range. Neuroplasticity is highest here. A session in the evening competes with a fatiguing brain. 5 minutes in the morning often outperforms 30 minutes at night. Finally, a self-assessment framework. Signs that your brain is genuinely changing. The moment you notice a distracted thought during meditation, you return to your object of attention more quickly than before. In daily life, when an impulse arises, there is a brief gap, 1 or 2 seconds, before you act. When something difficult happens, you return to your baseline more quickly than you used to. And others notice something in you, a softness, a stillness that wasn't there before. Signs that the practice has drifted into something less useful. You feel heavier, not lighter after sitting. The moment you open your eyes, you're back in the same loop of reactivity. A quiet sense of spiritual superiority toward people who don't meditate has begun to form. Time on the cushion feels like something to get through rather than something to enter. And one more thing to carry with you always. If an intrusive thought arises 100 times during a session, that is not 100 failures. That is 100 successful repetitions of the most important skill meditation trains, noticing and returning. The weight of the intrusive thought is the resistance that builds the prefrontal muscle. The heavier the weight, the greater the gain. The only genuine waste of time is sitting for 30 minutes without ever noticing that you've drifted. Chapter 13. When the prefrontal cortex collapses from psychopaths to dementia. Until now, we have talked about strengthening the prefrontal cortex. Now we need to look at the other side. What happens to the human brain when the prefrontal cortex collapses entirely? Answering this question will give you the most powerful motivation you will ever find for protecting your daily practice, even when it's just 3 minutes. When neuroscientists scan the brains of psychopaths and serial killers using fMRI and PET imaging, a strikingly consistent finding emerges. The prefrontal cortex, particularly the orbitofrontal and ventromedial prefrontal regions, is measurably smaller and less active than in the general population. This is the ultimate destination of every mechanism we have examined throughout this audiobook: the complete inability to empathize, the total failure of the rational brake, the extinction of metacognitive self-awareness. The prefrontal cortex doesn't just weaken, it effectively disappears. And this is what remains. The pioneering research came from American neuroscientist Professor James Fallon, who analyzed PET brain scans from large numbers of convicted killers and individuals with psychopathic traits. The common finding was stark. The prefrontal cortex regions, responsible for rational judgment and impulse control, showed either dramatically reduced activity or measurably reduced physical volume. In most people, even when violent or destructive impulses arise, and they do in everyone, the prefrontal cortex immediately sends the signal, "No, that would be wrong. That would cause harm." This is precisely what Buddhism describes as the practices of patience and ethical conduct. But in serial killers, this break is not just weak, it is absent. The impulse arrives, and there is nothing between the impulse and the action. The mirror neurons are gone too. Earlier, we discussed how wealth can gradually deactivate the mirror neuron system, the empathy circuit. In psychopaths, this deactivation is essentially complete, either from birth or through catastrophic early developmental damage. When another person screams in pain, when they beg to be spared, the empathy circuit generates no response. The suffering of another human being is processed the way a stone breaking on the pavement is processed. Not with cruelty exactly, with nothing. The circuitry that would recognize another person as a person is simply not running. And dopamine dysregulation completes the picture. When the prefrontal cortex shrinks, the amygdala expands into the space of leaves. People with severely damaged prefrontal cortices often experience a chronic anhedonia, a near-total absence of dopamine response to ordinary life. The small pleasures that sustain most people, conversation, food, quiet satisfactions, produce almost nothing. The brain searches for stimuli strong enough to break through. And when violent acts are committed, the neurological effect is an explosion of dopamine that the shrunken prefrontal cortex cannot suppress. The cycle then becomes self-reinforcing. The crime produces the only dopamine the brain can access. Addiction to violence follows. Now let's step back and look at the 4 pathways through which prefrontal cortex atrophy actually occurs, because while the serial killer is an extreme case, the mechanisms are far more widespread than most people realize. The first pathway is chronic stress and cortisol. This is the most common and entirely acquired. When a person sustains extreme stress over a long period, cortisol floods the system. The prefrontal cortex is unusually dense with cortisol receptors, which makes it exceptionally vulnerable. Excess cortisol physically shrinks the dendritic branches of prefrontal neurons and severs the synaptic connections between them. Volume decreases. Serious trauma, PTSD, follows the same pathway, often disrupting normal prefrontal development or producing measurable atrophy. The second pathway is psychiatric illness and neurodevelopmental disorder. MRI studies of patients with chronic major depression consistently show reduced gray matter volume in the prefrontal cortex. This creates a vicious cycle. As the cortex weakens, emotional regulation becomes harder, which deepens the depression, which further weakens the cortex. ADHD involves delayed development or reduced volume of prefrontal structures, particularly in the right prefrontal lobe, which directly explains the characteristic difficulties with impulse control, sustained attention, and planning. And in antisocial personality disorder and psychopathy, research by Professor Adrian Raine and others has documented gray matter volume reductions of approximately 11 to 14% in the orbitofrontal prefrontal cortex compared to the general population. This is not a small number. It is a structural difference with profound behavioral consequences. The third pathway is addiction. Long-term alcohol consumption and drug abuse directly damage prefrontal neurons. The characteristic impulse pattern of addiction, choosing immediate pleasure over delayed reward, regardless of known long-term consequences, is not a failure of will. It is the behavioral signature of a prefrontal cortex that has been structurally compromised by the substance itself. The fourth pathway is degenerative brain disease and physical injury. Frontotemporal dementia, FTD, begins precisely in the frontal lobe, unlike Alzheimer's disease, which typically begins in memory-related regions. The early presentation is not memory loss, it is personality change. Impulse control deteriorates. Behavior becomes socially inappropriate. The person may become suddenly aggressive or begin violating norms they observed without difficulty for decades. Some of what is dismissed as personality turning mean in old age is actually the early signature of this disease. Physical trauma to the frontal region, from automobile accidents, falls, can also produce direct cellular damage with lasting consequences. The most historically significant case in neuroscience is Phineas Gage, a railway worker who in 1848 survived the passage of an iron rod through his frontal lobe, and whose personality changed so dramatically afterward that people who knew him said he was no longer Gage. Now, here is the insight that ties everything together. Serial killers represent an extreme and specialized case, typically involving some combination of congenital abnormality and severe early trauma. But the directional logic is the same spectrum. When you become arrogant because money arrived, when you lash out at someone with less power because you can, when age has eroded the brake and small frustrations produce outsized anger, these are warning signals. The prefrontal cortex is quietly shrinking. The brake is wearing thin. The direction is the same track, not the same destination, but the same direction. This is why we meditate. This is why the 108 bows. This is why the 6 Paramitas. Because left unattended, the human brain drifts, naturally, without any malicious intent, toward the animal, and in the worst cases, beyond it. And now the most important point of this entire chapter: hope. Prefrontal atrophy caused by stress, depression, and early-stage addiction, in the absence of severe structural degeneration, is reversible. This is not optimism. It is neuroscience. Antidepressant treatment, the removal of chronic stressors, aerobic exercise, and above all, meditation and deep sleep, these have all been shown in rigorous brain imaging research to restore synaptic density in the prefrontal cortex, rebuild the neural connections that were severed, and recover the gray matter volume that was lost. The brain can be damaged, and through the principle of neuroplasticity, the brain can be repaired. Which direction it moves, that is determined by the choices you make every day. Chapter 14. Meditation and Success, the Leaders Who Strengthen Their Prefrontal Cortex. From a neuroscience perspective, when a human being physically expands the prefrontal cortex through meditation and cognitive training, they become substantially wiser, and the probability of achieving significant social and economic success increases dramatically. What modern society calls capability is no longer simply the capacity to memorize and recall. Solving complex problems, collaborating with others, sustaining progress toward long-term goals, these are the competencies that determine real-world outcomes, and every single one of them is governed by the prefrontal cortex. The cortex's core executive function, setting goals, establishing priorities, adapting flexibly to unexpected situations, is the same faculty that allows a business person to read a market before others do, or to transform a crisis into an opportunity.
In investing, in business negotiations, in any high-stakes domain, the most dangerous adversary is emotional reactivity, greed, panic, the urge to act when acting is the worst response. The person with a thick prefrontal cortex applies the brake to the amygdala's alarm signal and makes the rational, well-considered decision when everyone else is reacting. The brain refuses to be hijacked by emotion, and the probability of a devastating error drops precipitously. The developed prefrontal cortex also activates the mirror neuron system and the self and other affirmation network. This produces an almost preternatural capacity to read the intentions and emotional states of others, to communicate without defensiveness, to build alignment and trust across a team, to lead with authority that others choose to follow. When failure comes, the person with a developed metacognitive faculty doesn't collapse into self-blame. They analyze the cause dispassionately and redirect. The psychological term for this is resilience. From a neural perspective, it is the prefrontal cortex performing its top-down regulatory function in the face of adversity. The most accomplished leaders in the world practice meditation, and they are explicit about why. Steve Jobs maintained a Zen meditation practice throughout his life. He attributed his capacity for radical focus and intuitive decision-making to that practice. Ray Dalio, who built the world's largest hedge fund, has said publicly and repeatedly that meditation is the single most important factor in every success he has achieved, and he requires it of his entire organization. In a domain defined by volatility and uncertainty, the calm of a trained prefrontal cortex was not a luxury. It was the competitive advantage.
Google, Microsoft, and the majority of Silicon Valley's most successful companies have institutionalized mindfulness training. This is not corporate wellness sentiment. It is a strategy grounded in brain science. The talent you were born with, your IQ, your physical constitution, is largely fixed. The thickness and functionality of your prefrontal cortex is not. It can be grown, and the tool for growing it is meditation. Chapter 15. The Power Paradox: How Money and Success Can Destroy the Brain. In Chapter 13, we examined how meditation enables success. But here we encounter the largest irony humanity has ever produced. People who were humble and kind when they had little often become contemptuous and domineering when they acquire money or power. We tend to explain this in moral terms. They revealed their true nature, or they forgot where they came from. But the accurate explanation is neurological. Psychologists and neuroscientists call it the power paradox, a well-documented mechanism of brain damage. Money and power physically restructure the brain. Here's the most precise version of the folk saying. It's not that money reveals who you were. It's that money rewired the circuit that was remembering who you were. 3 mechanisms drive this. The first is the deactivation of mirror neurons, the loss of empathy. Around the prefrontal cortex lies a system of neurons whose function is to simulate the emotional and physical experience of others, to feel at some neural level what another person feels. This is the basis of empathy. When you are in similar circumstances to those around you, these neurons are active and responsive. But when money arrives, the brain recalibrates its survival logic. I no longer need to depend on others. I can secure safety independently. The evolutionary function of empathy, to navigate the complex social dependencies of resource-scarce environments, becomes unnecessary. And the brain, being ruthlessly efficient, begins to deactivate what it no longer needs.
Research by UC Berkeley psychologists Dr. Keltner confirmed this in fMRI studies. People of high socioeconomic status showed significantly reduced activity in the brain regions responsible for reading and responding to others' emotional states compared to their lower status counterparts. The circuit wasn't weakened by intention, it atrophied from disuse. The second mechanism is dopamine dysregulation and the extreme self-affirmation, other negation state. Wealth generates massive and sustained dopamine release. When this continues over time, the prefrontal cortex's capacity for rational self-assessment degrades. The wealthy person begins to construct a narrative. I earned this through superior intelligence and effort. The role of luck, timing, and the contributions of others is erased from memory, because the brain's reward system is producing so much dopamine that it has no need to search for alternate explanations. And the inverse develops. Those who are struggling are seen through the lens of the same logic. Their condition reflects their choices. Their deficiency reflects their character. The person who once understood poverty from the inside is now contemptuous of it, because the brain that did the understanding has been replaced by one that has been chemically convinced of its own exceptionalism. The third mechanism is testosterone-driven hierarchical dominance. Rising social status increases testosterone levels in both men and women. In high concentrations, testosterone shifts the brain's social perception from "this is a person I'm in relationship with" to "this is a person in a hierarchy, above me or below me." What follows is the extraction of what psychologists call dominant satisfaction from interactions with subordinates or service workers, a gratification that is neurologically very close to the primitive dopamine reward of establishing rank within a primate troop. The amygdala, freed from top-down regulation by a weakened prefrontal cortex, can run this program openly. The deeper evolutionary irony deserves attention. The brain's primary objective is not moral excellence. For several million years, its sole mandate has been survival and reproduction. In an ancestral environment, resources and physical attractiveness were the most reliable guarantors of survival. The brain categorizes the acquisition of wealth accordingly. The survival competition is won. I no longer need to expend costly cognitive resources on reading and accommodating others.
So, the neural circuits that performed that social reading, empathy, perspective-taking, the capacity for genuine relationship, are marked as redundant and begin to be pruned. The tragedy, human beings run toward the thing called success, and the destination of that race is the deactivation of what made them human in the first place. Physical attractiveness drives the exact same pattern. Someone who receives consistent preferential treatment, attention, and resources simply by existing learns, neurologically, that social responsiveness is not required. The system runs on autopilot without it. Mirror neurons weaken. The extreme self-affirmation, other negation state, sometimes recognized clinically as narcissism, develops not through conscious choice, but through the gradual logic of neural optimization. Throughout history, a small number of individuals have recognized this dynamic and refused to be taken by it. We call them saints, sages, teachers, exemplars. The Buddha abandoned a prince's inheritance of wealth, beauty, and power precisely because he understood what these things were doing to the minds of those who held them. The respected and beloved philanthropists of every era, who give wealth away and maintain daily practices of humility, are not performing virtue. They are protecting their own neural architecture from the most powerful neurotoxin ever produced by human civilization.
The dopamine flood of wealth and power is strong enough to corrode the prefrontal cortex. Only meditation, which physically rebuilds the empathy circuitry, reactivates the mirror neuron system, and inhibits the dopamine cascade through the direct recalibration of the brain's hardware, can hold that off. Here is the practical formula. Wealth plus power, right-pointing arrow, empathy shutdown, right-pointing arrow, judgment impairment, right-pointing arrow, self-destruction. And the corrective. The wealthiest people in the world who remain genuinely good, who stay wise and trustworthy over decades, are the ones who sit on a cushion every morning not because they believe it makes them virtuous, but because they know with hard-won precision what skipping it costs their brains. Meditation makes the poor person wealthy, and it keeps the wealthy person human. Chapter 16. The privilege of being human, the only creature that can break its own chain. This chapter contains the most essential message in this entire audiobook. We say of animals how limited they are, and the reason is clear. Their small prefrontal cortex leaves them governed entirely by instinct. What is remarkable is that the same neurological structure explains why the great meditation teachers throughout history have looked at ordinary human beings with something like grief. Their sadness was not moral judgment. It was recognition of a tragedy. People born with the most powerful cognitive architecture in the known universe, 30% of the brain given over to the prefrontal command center, and they never use it. They spend their lives as prisoners of the amygdala's alarm system, driven by anxiety, status comparison, and the same impulsive circuits as the animals they imagine themselves to be above. This is what Buddhism means by ignorance, Avidyā, the root affliction, not moral deficiency, the failure to recognize what you are capable of, and therefore the failure to use it. And here is where the greatness of the human position reveals itself. Animals are limited by hardware. A dog cannot grow a larger prefrontal cortex through practice. The genome has set the ceiling, and no act of will can raise it. The instinctual orbit is fixed. Humans are different. Even now, saturated in worry, easily startled, struggling with emotional regulation, a human being can deliberately close their eyes, attend to their breath, and in doing so, physically expand the brain's governing hardware. Neuroscientists call this directed attention, intentional, voluntary focus. No other animal can redirect its own neural development. No other creature on Earth can consciously redesign its own prefrontal architecture. Self-modification, genuine self-modification, at the level of neural tissue, is a privilege available only to human beings. The 3 levels of being map out clearly. The first level is the animal, 1 to 17% prefrontal cortex, governed entirely by the present moment's demands. No anxiety about the future, but also no growth, no evolution, no agency. The DMN doesn't exist in a form that produces rumination.
The animal lives in the now, not by choice, but by construction. The second level is the ordinary human. 30% prefrontal cortex, the most sophisticated cognitive hardware on the planet. But the hardware is left largely idle. The DMN runs unchecked. The amygdala runs the show. The result? All of the suffering that comes with human self-awareness, comparison, regret, anticipatory dread without the compensating wisdom. Buddhism calls this state ignorance. The third level is the meditating human. The same 30% prefrontal cortex plus the physical thickening and densification of that tissue that comes from consistent practice. Top-down control of the amygdala. The ability to arrive through intentional effort at the same present moment clarity that the animal has by default, except chosen, cultivated, hard-won. Buddhism calls this state Prajnā. The paradox at the center of this: animals live in the present moment because they cannot transcend it. Meditating humans arrive at the present moment through the full development of the capacity to transcend it. These may look like the same destination. They are not. The peace of the animal is the peace of incapacity. The peace of the sage is the peace of mastery. There is an ancient teaching found across cultures that goes roughly, to be born human is as rare as the chance of a blind sea turtle rising for air once in 100 years, putting its head through a single floating wooden ring, drifting in a vast and limitless ocean. The neuroscientific meaning of this teaching is now transparent. The only creature that can grow its own prefrontal cortex, that can understand with clarity what it needs to do, that can choose against fatigue, against distraction, against the resistance of the habitual mind to practice. This combination exists nowhere else in the known universe. Let the conclusion be simple and direct. Animals cannot become wise. The hardware forbids it. Ordinary human beings can become wise, but most will not, because knowing the method and using the method are separated by the enormous gap of will and consistency. The meditating person, the one who does it anyway, even when it's inconvenient, even when it feels useless, even when the mind is loudly insisting that it isn't working, that person is doing something that no other species in the history of life on Earth has ever done. They are deliberately evolving themselves. That is the privilege of being human. Chapter 17. The 6 Paramitas, Buddhism's complete scientific manual for brain evolution. Buddhism's framework of the 6 Paramitas, the 6 transcendent virtues, appears in its ancient formulation as a system of religious precepts. But translated into the language of neuroscience, it turns out to be a complete and rigorous 6-part protocol for preventing the brain from degenerating into the power paradox state we explored in Chapter 14, and for developing the prefrontal cortex to its maximum capacity. Everything we have discussed in this audiobook converges here. The first paramita is generosity, Dāna. The traditional meaning, giving freely without expectation of return. The neurological meaning, emergency resuscitation of the empathy circuit. As we established, the first casualty of wealth and power is the mirror neuron system, the neural substrate of empathy. The deliberate act of giving to others forcibly reactivates the deactivating circuit. Oxytocin and serotonin flood the brain at the moment of genuine generosity. The "I'm okay, you're okay" state is immediately established. For anyone accumulating resources and power, this is the first line of neurodefense against the power paradox. The second paramita is ethical conduct, Śīla. The traditional meaning, refraining from harmful action, holding oneself to a voluntary standard of behavior. The neurological meaning, targeted strength training for the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the brain's rational brake. When money and power accumulate, testosterone and dopamine flood the system, and the impulse to exercise dominance, to do whatever one can get away with, asserts itself with increasing force. The practice of ethical conduct is the practice of saying, "I could, but I won't," and repeating that act of restraint consistently. Every instance thickens the brake. The braking muscle grows stronger with each repetition. The third paramita is patience, Kṣānti. The traditional meaning, enduring insult, difficulty, and frustration without reactive anger. The neurological meaning, the highest form of top-down amygdala control and metacognitive development. When someone provokes you, the amygdala fires. The feeling of anger is real and immediate. Patience is not the suppression of this feeling. It is the capacity, in the moment of activation, to observe the feeling without becoming it. I can feel anger arising, but is this the right response to this situation? What actually needs to happen here? This is metacognition, applied under pressure. Every successful instance expands the metacognitive circuit. The fourth paramita is diligence, Vīrya. The traditional meaning, tireless, sustained effort in the cultivation of the mind, not giving in to laziness. The neurological meaning, the application of the neuroplasticity principle. The brain grows stronger with use and atrophies without it. The prefrontal cortex is no exception. The aging brain, left unexercised, thins year by year, losing gray matter density, weakening the braking system, allowing the amygdala to gain ground. The practice of diligence, maintaining the commitment to practice consistently, even when it's uncomfortable, is the practice of directing neuroplasticity consciously, of deciding that the brain will be used in the direction of wisdom, not allowed to drift in the direction of reactivity. The fifth paramita is meditative absorption, Dāna. The traditional meaning, concentrated, undistracted, unbroken quietude of mind. The neurological meaning, the complete shutdown of the default mode network and the induction of the alpha-theta wave state. This is precisely what we have been building toward throughout this entire audiobook. The cessation of the internal broadcast, the runaway narrative of past regret and future anxiety that the DMN generates, and the entry into a state of deep rest and neural optimization. Whether through breath meditation, mantra recitation, 108 bows, or any other form of focused practice, the mechanism is the same. The DMN quiets. The hardware recovers. The prefrontal cortex is restored. The sixth paramita is wisdom, Prajnā. The traditional meaning, the understanding that all things are impermanent, interdependent, and not ultimately separate. The complete awakening to the nature of reality. The neurological meaning, the full activation of metacognitive capacity. This is where the other five paramitas lead. The prefrontal cortex, built to its maximum capacity through sustained practice of all five disciplines, arrives at a state of awareness in which the self can be observed from outside itself, in which the fake news of anxiety is recognized as such, in which the accumulation of wealth and status no longer carries the power to corrupt the quality of perception. The neural architecture that produces this state is what Buddhism has always called wisdom. Let the correspondence be fully stated. Generosity rebuilds the empathy circuit. Ethical conduct strengthens the rational brake. Patience develops the metacognitive faculty under pressure. Diligence maintains neural health against the forces of aging and atrophy. Meditative absorption shuts down the DMN and optimizes the command center. And wisdom is what the fully developed prefrontal cortex produces, spontaneously, naturally, as its default expression. The six paramitas are not religion. They are a complete scientific instruction manual for brain evolution. What Buddhism's greatest teachers understood 2,500 years ago through direct contemplative investigation, neuroscience is now confirming, frame by frame, through fMRI imaging and longitudinal neurological studies. The protocol for protecting the prefrontal cortex from the forces of power, wealth, and aging, and for developing it toward its highest function, matches the ancient teaching with a precision that feels frankly astonishing. Whether you are building towards something or protecting what you have built, this framework is the most complete answer available. Chapter 18. The Paradox of Adversity. When things don't work out, the brain evolves. At the intersection of ancient Taoist philosophy, the cyclical yin-yang logic of the I Ching, and modern neuroscience's principle of neuroplasticity, there is a truth that most people spend their entire lives missing. We might call it the curse of the person for whom everything works out, and the hidden blessing of the person for whom nothing does. Let's begin with the paradox of adversity. When life refuses to cooperate, when plans fail, when the effort doesn't produce results, when the path forward is blocked, the human brain enters the most intense evolutionary training it will ever undergo. The brain declares an emergency. In order to survive, it activates the prefrontal cortex at full capacity. The questions begin. What went wrong? What am I missing? What needs to change? This relentless analytical pressure, what we have been calling metacognition throughout this audiobook, drives the prefrontal neurons to form new connections at an accelerating rate. The cortex thickens. BDNF, the brain's own growth hormone we discussed in Chapter 4, floods the prefrontal tissue. It's the same mechanism as muscle growth. The muscle fiber tears under heavy resistance, and then it rebuilds, thicker and stronger than before. The weight of adversity is the resistance that builds the prefrontal cortex. And only the person who has been through that training carries the neural hardware capable of sustaining genuine success when it finally arrives. Now let's look at the other side, what I'm calling the trap of smooth sailing. The person for whom everything succeeds too easily, too quickly, without real resistance, is in the most neurologically dangerous position of all. The brain is wired to conserve energy. When there is no friction, no failure requiring analysis, no gap between expectation and reality demanding creative response, the brain switches to autopilot. The prefrontal cortex, finding nothing difficult to process, begins to atrophy from disuse. Worse, the dopamine that comes from effortless success is real, but it selectively blinds the circuits responsible for self-assessment. The person begins to confuse luck with genius. The metacognitive capacity to see one's own limitations, to hear warnings, to take risks seriously, gradually shuts down. The brake weakens precisely when it is needed most. And when the inevitable crisis arrives, as it always does, there is nothing between the situation and the collapse. This is not a moral observation. It is a description of what happens neurologically to a prefrontal cortex that has never been forced to grow under load. Now, a word about the blessing of scarcity. Someone who grew up with everything provided rarely develops a highly sensitive happiness circuit. The brain's threshold for satisfaction has been set high from the beginning. Ordinary pleasures don't register. Quiet achievements go unfelt. But someone who has known real scarcity, who has felt the absence of things, who has had to work for what others received without effort, that person's brain is tuned to a much lower frequency. Small gains produce large happiness responses. Daily progress generates real dopamine. Every step forward is experienced as a genuine reward, because the brain has not been overstimulated into numbness. Their resilience is also categorically different. When the storm arrives, they say, quietly from some stable place, "I've been through worse than this." And they mean it, and they solve the problem. Now I want to go deeper into one of the most important questions this audiobook can address. What is the relationship between The Secret, the 2006 book by Rhonda Byrne that sold over 30 million copies worldwide, and meditation? The Secret's core message is simple. Intensely visualize what you want, and it will be drawn toward you through the law of attraction. Is this neuroscience? Is it fantasy? The honest answer is, half of it is remarkably accurate neuroscience, and half of it is a genuinely dangerous misunderstanding. And meditation is precisely what separates one half from the other. Let me start with what The Secret gets right. The scientific foundation of The Secret's law of attraction is a real neurological structure called the reticular activating system, the RAS. The brain receives approximately 11 million bits of information per second. It consciously processes about 40. Everything else is filtered out automatically. The RAS is that filter, and crucially, it is programmable. When you set a clear, specific, emotionally vivid goal and focus on it consistently, the RAS begins treating that goal as a priority category. Information, people, and opportunities that were always present in your environment but previously filtered out as irrelevant now pass through to conscious awareness. The world hasn't changed. Your brain's filter has. You've experienced this. You decide to buy a particular car, and suddenly you see that car everywhere. You become pregnant, and suddenly the world seems full of pregnant women. The cars and the women were always there. Your RAS was simply not forwarding them. This is 100% real neuroscience. Visualization also works for a neurologically verifiable reason. The brain processes vivid, imagined experience and actual experience through overlapping neural circuits. In a well-known study, basketball players who spent practice sessions mentally rehearsing perfect free throws showed nearly equivalent skill improvement to those who spent the same time physically practicing. Vivid visualization pre-installs the neural circuitry of success. The brain treats it as something it has already done. Now let me tell you what the secret gets wrong and why it fails for so many people who practice it diligently. The problem is not the intention. The problem is the emotional state from which the intention is launched. When intensely wanting something becomes, "I'm anxious and desperate because I don't have it yet," the neurological effect is the exact opposite of what the secret promises. Desire rooted in a felt sense of lack, "I need this and I don't have it," triggers the cortisol stress response. Cortisol suppresses the prefrontal cortex and activates the amygdala. The brain enters survival mode. In survival mode, the RAS doesn't scan for opportunities, it scans for threats. Creative problem-solving shuts down. Behavior becomes frantic and repellent. People sense the desperate energy and withdraw. Lack-based desire produces the very neurological conditions that make the desired outcome less likely to arrive. This is why so many sincere, hard-working practitioners of the secret see no results. They are sending cortisol, not intention, into their neural environment. Here is where meditation enters and changes everything. The correct sequence is 3 steps. The first step is goal setting, the secret's contribution. You define what you want with specificity and vividness. You activate the RAS. You encode the goal in the present tense as if already achieved. The second step is emotional reset, meditation's contribution. The anxiety, the impatience, the gap awareness, "Why isn't this here yet?" is dissolved through meditation practice. Serotonin and oxytocin restore the brain to what might be called an abundance state. I am sufficient right now, and what I am moving toward is already on its way. This is not pretense. This is a neurologically real shift in the brain's operating mode. The third step is action, the product of both. With the RAS antenna active and the emotional state calm, you take today's available action steadily, without urgency, without desperation. You remain alert to relevant signals and responsive to opportunity. You move. This is what Buddhism calls the simultaneous operation of pranidhana and upekkha, intense aspiration and complete non-attachment to outcome. In neuroscience, it is the simultaneous activation of the prefrontal goal-setting system and the serotonin-based equanimity circuit. It is the brain's highest performance state. A final note on the secret's gratitude journal practice. Recording daily gratitude is, in fact, a powerful neuroscientific tool. The act of consciously identifying and articulating what is good in the present activates the brain's reward circuit and stimulates the left prefrontal cortex, the center of positive emotion and contentment, which we discussed in Chapter 8 as the seat of the happiness set point. Gratitude also releases oxytocin, establishing the self and other affirmation state automatically. The Secret's gratitude journal and the loving-kindness meditation we discussed in Chapter 3 stimulate essentially the same neural circuitry through different pathways. The one-sentence conclusion on The Secret? It is half right. The missing half is meditation. Visualize from abundance, not from lack. Act from calm, not from desperation. The emotional state that makes the visualization work is the very state that meditation produces. The one-sentence summary of this chapter? When things are not working out, it is not a sign that you are failing. It is the universe giving your prefrontal cortex the training it will need to sustain and not be destroyed by the success that is coming. If you are in a difficult season right now, try this reframe. "Oh, things aren't flowing? This is my prefrontal cortex's strength training session." That single act of metacognition, reframing adversity as neurodevelopment, is the beginning of the alchemy that turns suffering into wisdom. Chapter 19. Conclusion. What it means to change the brain. We have arrived at the final chapter of this long journey. Meditation is not a relaxation technique. It is neural training, the physical reconstruction of the brain's hardware, strengthening the prefrontal cortex, regulating the default mode network, calming the amygdala, enabling the brain to produce its own supply of dopamine, serotonin, and oxytocin. Everything we have covered leads to the same three outcomes: the capacity to maintain cognitive function as we age, freedom from the crushing weight of daily worry and anxiety, and the ability to move through life with genuine trust in ourselves and others. Even in the face of money, power, and the ancient pull of status, the 6 Paramitas give us the means to remain human, to keep the prefrontal cortex intact, to refuse the power paradox. Animals cannot reach wisdom. Their hardware forbids it. But human beings, even reluctantly, even imperfectly, even against resistance, can. That is the privilege that this body and this brain make possible. That is what meditation is for. Simply by listening to this audiobook, your brain has already begun to change. A seed has been planted in the neural circuitry. A new architecture has been primed. What remains is simple. Tomorrow morning, when you wake, close your eyes for 5 minutes. Follow your breath. No special conditions required. No perfection required. Just a little more often than yesterday. A little more consistent than before. That's all the brain needs, and it will change. What we change through this practice is not merely a mood, not merely a perspective, not merely a feeling. We change the brain itself. This audiobook is based on Meditation and Neuroscience, the scientific method of rewiring your brain.